Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Richard Speck. So let's find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Richard Franklin Speck was born December 6th, 1941. He lived in Kirkwood, Illinois, and he was the seventh of 8 children. He was raised in a very religious family. Richard was very close to his father, who died unexpectedly in 1947 from a heart attack at only 53 years old. At the time of his passing, Richard was only 6 years old. In school, he was considered to be a poor student and began his life of crime at a very young age. Well, a few years later, Richard's mother met and started dating a man named Carl August Rudolph Lindbergh. Carl was an alcoholic and had a 25-year criminal record that started with forgery and included several arrests for drunk driving. Carl was the complete opposite of Richard's father. Richard's father was sober and hardworking. Carl was neither of those things. Well, Richard's mother married Carl on May 10th, 1950. This did not sit well with Richard. He hated him. He hated how often he was drunk and frequently absent. He also claims his stepfather psychologically abused him with insults and threats. Richard, who was a poor student, by now just altogether dropped out of high school during the 9th grade. By this point as well, not only was Richard drinking, he started drinking at 12, but now at age 15, he was getting drunk almost every day. His first arrest, already came and gone, was when he was 13 for trespassing. But now these arrests would be followed up with dozens of other arrests for misdemeanors over the next 8 years. October 1961. Richard met 15-year-old Shirley Annette Malone at the Texas State Fair. After only 3 weeks of dating, she became pregnant. They married on January 19th, 1962. When their daughter, Robbie Lynn, was born on July 5th, 1962, Shirley gave birth alone in the hospital. She didn't know where Richard was. Where the hell was he? He was serving a 22-day jail sentence for disturbing the peace after a drunken incident. Now in July 1963, 21-year-old Richard was caught having forged and cashed a coworker's $44 paycheck and for having burglarized a grocery store. He stole cigarettes, beer, and $3 in cash. He was convicted of forgery and burglary and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was paroled after only serving just 16 months. 1 week after his parole, on January 9th, 1965, Richard used a knife to attack a woman in the parking lot of her apartment building. Richard was convicted of aggravated assault and was given a 16-month sentence that was to run concurrently with a parole violation sentence. So he was returned to prison. He did not stay there very long. On July 2nd, 1965, due to an error, Richard was released from prison. This was only 6 months later. His parole violation sentence was considered completed. January 1966. Richard's wife, she had enough and she filed for divorce. Well, that same month, January 1966, Richard stabbed a man in a knife fight. He was charged with aggravated assault, but he was able to get the charge reduced to disturbing the peace. He was only fined $10. Well, he failed to pay the fine and went to jail, but only for 3 days. March 5th, 1966. Richard bought a car. The following night, he burglarized a grocery store. He stole 70 cartons of cigarettes, then boldly sold the cigarette cartons out of the trunk of his car in the grocery store's parking lot. After, he just abandoned his vehicle. Well, police were quickly able to trace the car's owner to Richard. They issued a warrant for his arrest. This arrest would mean another prison term. So what did Richard do? He fled. Now, where was he? Where was he staying? Well, other crimes were still happening. Let's see, on April 3rd, 1966, a 65-year-old woman named Virgil Harris returned home at 1 a.m. to find a burglar in her home. He showed a knife. He blindfolded her, tied her, raped her, and ransacked her home. He also stole the $2.50 that she had earned that evening from babysitting. After the attack, she contacted police, and she described the intruder as a 6-foot-tall white man who was, quote, very polite, end quote, and spoke, quote, very softly with a southern drawl, end quote. 1 week later, on April 9th, 1966, a 32-year-old woman named Mary Kay Pierce was last seen leaving the tavern that she worked in around 12:45 a.m. She was reported missing on April 13th. That same day she was reported missing, her body was found in an empty hog house that was behind the tavern that she was working in. She died from a blow to her abdomen that ruptured her liver. Well, Richard, when he was considered a suspect, so they briefly questioned him, but then asked him to stay in town for further questioning. He agreed. When police showed up at the hotel where he was staying to further question him, they found that he had left town only a few hours earlier. Well, police were at his room anyway, so they searched it. What they found was a radio and costume jewelry that Virgil Harris had missing from her home. That family reported missing after the attack. There was also items from 2 other local burglaries that had occurred in the past month that police had no suspects for. Well, where was Richard? He was bouncing around and staying with various family members, and he was doing basic jobs to earn enough money to get by. One prospective job his brother drove him to, and was at the National Maritime Union in Chicago. On this day that his brother drove him to file the paperwork for the Seaman's card, the hiring hall where the paperwork was occurring was 1 block east from 6 attached 2-story brick townhouses. One of these townhouses was occupied by a group of local registered nurses. July 11th, 1966. Richard at this point was staying with his sister, but had completely outstayed his welcome. So over the next several nights, he stayed at various rooming houses. July 13th, 1966. Richard spent the day drinking in nearby taverns. A woman named Ella Mae Hooper, who was 53 years old, had spent the day drinking at the same taverns that Richard did. Well, they began speaking, and he took her to his room at the Shipyard Inn. When they got there, he raped her and stole her .22 caliber revolver. January 13th, 1966. At 11 p.m., Richard broke into a South Chicago townhouse and took hostage several nursing students. This happened because he knocked on the door of the apartment building. When one of the nursing students opened it, he brandished a handgun. He grabbed her by her wrist and dragged her back into the apartment complex. When they got in there, all of the other nursing students who were in there were terrified So he dragged them and forced them into one of the back bedrooms. He made them sit in a semicircle. He told them he was only there to rob them. This was to calm them down and make them think everything would be okay. At 2 points in the night, 3 other nursing students came home. They each screamed when they saw what was happening. They too became forced to be held hostage with the rest of the women. It is at this time that police speculate that with each of the new women coming into the apartment complex, Richard lost count of how many women were actually there. One by one, Richard raped, beat, and killed each of the nursing students by stabbing them to death with a knife or by suffocating them. After each murder, he would wash up and change his white shirt. Well, one of the women, Cora Amaral, she survived the attack. She hid under a bed silently while one of her housemates were being killed. She stayed hidden after Richard left. She was terrified. Was he coming back? She didn't know. So she stayed till almost 6 a.m. When she emerged, she climbed out of her bedroom window and walked onto the ledge and screamed, quote, "They're all dead. All of my friends are dead," end quote. The police identified 2 fingerprints that were left at the scene. Those fingerprints belonged to Richard Speck. Well, Richard, now his face and his name was all over the news and in the newspapers. So July 17th, 1966, he picked up a bottle of wine at a local liquor store, along with several of the newspapers with his name and photo splashed across it. He then drank the bottle of wine, slipped into the bathroom down the hall of where he was staying, smashed the bottle, and cut his wrist and inner elbows. Clearly, he would rather face committing suicide than go back to jail. Well, someone found him and recognized him and called 911. However, it wasn't until at the hospital where a surgical resident physician recognized from the newspaper stories reported the tattoo "Born to Raise Hell." Well, he saw the paper and saw Richard's arm and realized it was the same person. So police were contacted. Now, awaiting trial, Richard's competency and sanity was looked into by 6 physicians and 1 general surgeon. What they determined was he was competent to stand trial, and they concluded that he had not been insane at the time of the murders. So April 3rd, 1967, Richard's trial began. The one survivor, Cora Amaral, testified at the trial. A dramatic moment occurred when she was on the witness stand and asked if she could identify the killer, those who killed her fellow students. She rose from her seat in the witness box, walked directly in front of Richard, and pointed her finger at him. April 15th, 1967. After only 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Richard Speck guilty. They recommended the death penalty. June 5th, 1967, the judge sentenced Richard to die in the electric chair, but granted him an immediate stay pending automatic appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court. Well, the conviction and death sentence was upheld on November 22nd, 1968. On June 28, 1971, the United States Supreme Court reversed Richard's death sentence. What they claimed was objectors to capital punishment had been systematically excluded from his jury. So they remanded the case back to the Illinois Supreme Court just for resentencing. So on June 29th, 1972, the United States Supreme Court, as we know, declared the death penalty unconstitutional. because its arbitrary and inconsistent imposition constituted cruel and unusual punishment. So what did that mean for Richard? On November 21st, 1972, Richard was resentenced. What he received was 400 to 1,200 years in prison, which was 8 consecutive sentences of 50 to 150 years. In 1973, his sentence was reduced to a new statutory maximum of 300 years, making him eligible for parole now in 1977. Well, he was denied parole in 7 minutes at his first parole hearing on September 15th, 1976. During 6 subsequent parole hearings in 1977, 1978, 1981, 1984, 1987, and 1990, he was again denied parole. While in prison, he was often caught with drugs or distilled moonshine. Punishment for his infractions never stopped him. Richard Speck died on May 5th, 1991 from a heart attack. His body was never claimed, and he was cremated. So that should be where the story ends. Not even close. In May 1996, television news anchor Bill Curtis received a videotape that was made at Richard's prison sometime before the end of 1991. These tapes were shown on A&E's network Investigative Reports, and it shocked and angered the public. The video showed prisoners passing money and drugs around without fear of being caught. They were also engaging in sexual acts, and in the center of all of it was Richard Speck. He was doing cocaine and was parading around in silk panties, and most shockingly, had female-like breasts that were grown from smuggled hormone treatments. In the video, he said, quote, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose," end quote. From behind the camera, a prisoner asked Richard why he killed the nurses. Richard shrugged and jokingly said, quote, "It just wasn't their night," end quote. And that is the case of Richard Speck. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Danny After Dark. Do you have a question about the case or a comment? Leave it below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a case suggestion that you'd like me to cover? Well, leave it below, and you may see it featured in another episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.